Welcome to the KuppingerCole Analyst Chat. I'm your host. My name is Matthias. I'm an analyst and advisor at KuppingerCole Analysts. My guest today is Paul Fischer. He is senior analyst with KuppingerCole and he's working out of London. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Matthias. How are you?
I'm fine and I'm happy to have you today. We will be catching up on a topic that we covered in an earlier episode of this podcast. We want to talk about privileged access management, but this time in a somewhat different flavor. You did some research and provided some research recently, and you're currently still working on that for privileged access management when it comes to DevOps environments. First of all, maybe a quick definition. What is DevOps when you're looking at that?
DevOps is basically just a quick piece of history. So it's a combination of what used to be called development and operations, and the two had sort of different ways of working. And then I think about 10 years ago, there was a culture arose in IT circles where dev and operations started to work together to share knowledge, because before they had been working in silos and this was caused delays, etc. So the idea was to create a more agile working environment so that devs and ops would share stuff between each other. And it's pretty much worked. And the reason why it's worked is because one of the reasons is that they have access to data and things they need much more efficiently, which brings us on to privileged access management.
Right. And of course, DevOps also is of high importance when it comes to software-defined infrastructure. So when you create new virtual computers, new systems, new containers in the cloud, and change these systems rapidly over time. And as you've mentioned, security often is the missing link between the dev and the ops. So many blog posts have been written about DevSecOps, so to really get to a more secure approach here. But when you've mentioned already protecting privileged accounts, what changes when you look at a DevOps environment? Which are the privileges to protect here?
The thing that traditionally PAM, as we all know, has been for admin accounts and other high-value accounts given out to certain people in the organization. What's changed is that the sort of definition of what's privileged has changed, and the number of people that are using privileged accounts has escalated quite significantly. And DevOps has contributed to that change. When you talk about software-defined networks and these engineering that goes on almost every day in organizations now, where applications and other pieces are updated maybe even several times a day, that's the speed that these people are working at. But to ensure that they actually get this done, they need to access particular things like containers, and they need to access code, and they need to access APIs and everything else which makes the whole thing work. And within all that are secrets that would include things like passwords, but also perhaps pieces of code that are needed to help another piece of code, etc. And it's become obvious that all that has become very tempting to cyber criminals or cyber attackers, because they realize that this stuff is valuable. If they can get inside one piece of code, they may find gateways into other parts of the network. And what's been happening, I think, in DevOps is that because the guys working there are under pressure to deliver, that they sometimes cut corners, or they make secrets available to each other without properly protecting them. So it became obvious that these things we would define as privilege needed protecting from privileged access management platforms. And so the research that I've been doing, I've done a couple of papers, but also we've been doing a leadership compass, which is an extension of the privileged access management leadership compass, which we did earlier in the year. And that is focused on PAM for DevOps. And we've looked at, I think it's about 8 or 10 individual vendors that we think are doing the best to serve this emerging market.
Okay, I think when we look at PAM for DevOps, we get to a different dimension of PAM as well. On the one hand, we are typically talking about the admin accessing something. So having access to a root account, to a highly privileged code repository. So this is really the human, that is developer/operations guy, accessing a system. But there is another dimension, and that is the communication between individual building blocks within a software-defined infrastructure or software-defined network. So really some system accounts, some technical accounts that then often in the cloud are represented by, of course, usernames and password in the worst of all worlds, but maybe also API tokens as credentials or certificates, etc. The vendors that you looked at, did they cover both aspects, or did I miss another aspect?
No, they covered that. The vendors in the report, which will be coming out early next year, there was different types of vendors within it. Some are what you might call the traditional PAM vendors, who are extending their functionality to cover DevOps, and also other agile environments, and even people using sort of multi-cloud environments, which have the same challenges that we've been talking about in DevOps. But we also included some vendors that wouldn't even be seen as traditional PAM vendors, but they do offer, for example, Vault technology, or they also offer certificate and passwordless based secrets management. I think what sort of become apparent to me looking at this area is that PAM for DevOps or other agile environments or other environments that I have access to a lot of secrets is kind of developing separately from what we might call the traditional area of PAM, which you talked about, which is protecting admin accounts, and the more kind of static area of PAM. PAM for DevOps is really dynamic, and that I think the vendors that we've covered have realized that they can't just say, well, our existing PAM platform, it can manage with DevOps. They can't just say that without actually adding new technology. And some of them have acquired smaller sort of startups that have enabled that, and others are developing it in-house. And the other thing is that I think we're seeing part of this emerging is a sort of hybrid PAM development, so that you may have organizations which have already PAM in place, but they may think about deploying another faster dynamic PAM purely to help those in DevOps and those in application development, etc. The critical thing, though, is that I don't believe that you can have one without the other. Just because PAM for DevOps works extremely rapidly and people need to get to secrets so they can get their job done, there still needs to be a system of record, and there still needs to be a session recording and management, and then you still need to know who's doing what. So it comes down to some kind of PAM, a hybrid PAM, or an existing PAM with the new DevOps in it, or a DevOps Vault or a certificate-based system that works with existing PAM, but can also integrate with those so that you have a record of what's happening for, GRC reasons. So that's critical. I don't think what should happen is organizations that are perhaps almost wholly based around DevOps or other agile means of development would not bother with the basic tenets of PAM, all of which you can read about in any of our documents on PAM.
Right, and I think, as you've mentioned, that finding the right balance between enabling people doing their job and providing the adequate level of security, compliance, and governance when dealing with highly privileged accounts and the elevated access that lies behind that, that is really crucial, because the last thing that you want to do to your developers and operations people doing this incredible agile work is to hinder them in achieving their goals. But nevertheless, when you are the CISO, when you are in an audit, legal, compliance team, you need to make sure that these highly critical systems that they are dealing with, building and operating on a daily basis are well maintained and well governed. So I think this balance is also highly important, to have a PAM solution that is up to speed to their processes.
You're absolutely right. And I think convenience versus security is something we talk about all the time in security, and it affects not just privilege access management, obviously, but even fundamental things like logging onto your email people need to do that as quickly as possible. And that's why we have all those authentication standards that make that happen. But I think DevOps works at such a speed and in such a different way to perhaps other parts of the organization that it's crucial in there. And also something else we haven't talked about is passwords. And you just mentioned it. Passwords are still very much part of PAM, and I think they'll continue to be so, particularly for like the more basic areas of PAM. But I think within DevOps, we need to have passwordless systems which use things like authentication keys or certificates, etc., and just in time, so that PAM becomes very much a one-off sort of operation. So that every time someone in DevOps wants to access some secrets or so, they get a certificate, they get it just in time, and then it's deleted so that once they finish that work, so you don't have any problem with sort of orphan accounts lying around. And I think that's another difference between what's happening in DevOps and the rest of the organization.
Right. One very important type of accounts that comes to my mind when we're talking about DevOps and of course cloud deployments are the root accounts that you get when you subscribe to a cloud service provider, say AWS or Azure, where you really are at the driver's seat for all the instances, all the software defined infrastructure that you have in place. Are these solutions also capable of maintaining these very simple but very, very powerful root or basic accounts when it comes to the AWS main account?
Well, there is a problem that some PAM needs, because all PAM providers, AWS, Azure, etc., they all have their own different standards and different controls. And some PAM solutions, yes, they can do that. And actually, AWS has a very small piece of privileged access management built in, but that's another story. But most of them will work with all the leading cloud providers. But then again, this is where certificate-based or passwordless-based has a strength, because it's cloud agnostic. So therefore, you can have a PAM system which will work with virtually, well, it should work with any cloud system. And although AWS has a large share of the market, it's not uncommon for companies to have Azure and AWS mixed, and indeed other cloud platforms within the organization. So we can't rely on either the cloud to protect privileged accounts, and we can't necessarily rely on password-based systems to protect privilege activity in the cloud.
Okay, I understand that, and you've mentioned that, and I've had a look at that already, that we have quite some research already around that topic. We have the leadership compass coming out early next year, as you've mentioned, where our audience can then have a look at the individual products and vendors that are available on the market. When we want to close with, say, some 3, 4, 5 key recommendations that you could give for somebody who is currently looking into the market of PAM solutions for DevOps, what would that be?
Well, the first one would be to wait until our report comes out.
If that is not an option.
But perhaps more seriously, then I think obviously hopefully our report is a good start, but also do research yourself. First of all, you need to understand what is happening in your organization. You may have DevOps happening and not really realize it, because some software development teams may be working like this and you don't know that. So it's important, like in any pre-deployment, to do a audit of what's happening in your organization. If you already have PAM installed, and there's a good chance you do, then obviously get in touch with your vendor to see what they're doing to provide for this sort of new age. And finally, I think don't panic. I think at the moment there is a risk. There is a security risk in some of what is happening in DevOps, but I think that it's still time to manage this and to look at the options that are available on the market, but also keep up to date. The PAM market is changing all the time, and the solutions that have been coming out for DevOps probably didn't even exist maybe 18 months ago. The other thing I would say is understand the choice that you have, that you may have multi-clouds working and you have obviously legacy operations happening at the same time. But PAM as a technology is becoming multifaceted as well. And you may want to investigate what I call, the multi-cloud solution, so that you have a very agile and speedy version of PAM that works for your DevOps departments, or your DevOps teams rather, and your teams using multi-cloud, and also work with the existing sort of legacy PAM. So the good news is that I think that there is more and more options now for privileged accounts. And sorry, I think I'm doing about 6 points, but the other point is that don't think that privileged accounts are just, as you mentioned, just root accounts or admin accounts anymore. Even Psychotic talking about all accounts being privileged accounts. So that might be a little bit of marketing messaging there, but it's kind of the way that everything is going, that because of digitalization and digital applications and the way that companies are changing, the idea of what is privileged and what is not is certainly blurring a lot more than it used to. So you might find also that ordinary end users, and of course applications themselves and the Internet of Things and other entities also are now being thrown into the mix. So lots of things are happening, but I think that the good news, to sort of sum up, I suppose, is that the PAM vendors are keeping up, and they're keeping up really well.
Yeah, good to hear that. And I think, that PAM for DevOps is one important facet, as you've mentioned, but it is just one of the overall PAM landscape that an organization will have to maintain to stay secure, to stay compliant, to make sure that their business is running in the way that they can serve their customers and rely on a secure operations here. I think for all of those of the audience who are interested in learning more, of course, there is already quite some material available, a white paper that you did around the management of privileged accounts for multi-cloud and DevOps environments. There is a leadership brief around already. Just go to our website, use the search engine, type in DevOps and maybe Fisher for your surname to get very quickly to these documents. If there are any open questions, please feel free to reach out to us and just send us a question. Get in touch with Paul and or me. And of course, this leadership compass will be the comprehensive work when it comes to assessing and identifying the right products. And we are happy to help here as well.
And of course, the leadership compass, the main one, is already online as well. So that would, although it's not focusing on DevOps, but it still give you a very good idea of what's in the market. And that was only published sort of June this year, so it's still pretty up to date.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing your insight on that interesting aspect of the PAM market. Looking forward to having you in a future episode soon.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be with you, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. You as well. Bye.
Bye.